pain of Black and brown folks has been delegitimized since the beginning of time. We are always having our hurt denied. We are always being talked out of our hurt.
For George Floyd, the ambulance was his hearse. Beyond question, he would be alive today if not for the pressure applied to his neck by fired Officer Derek Chauvin.
And what you see happening throughout this nation is unrest. And it will persist for as long as there is unrest. On full display, what you are seeing is the pain of Black folks that has been delegitimized for far too long. And so today we are going to be precise and prescriptive because the hurt and harm and the injustices that have been put on us were very precise. We're very prescriptive. We're very targeted. Here in Boston, they honor the organizing tradition and activist tradition of our communities, which is our organizers, our community builders, not destroyers.
I am tired of the injustice. I have a Black son, and I am concerned about him every day. I pray over him every day because what happened to Floyd could have happened to my son.
Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter!
Hennepin County Attorney Michael Freeman and I filed a complaint that charges police officer King, Lane, and Tao with aiding and abetting murder in the second degree, a felony offense. I strongly believe that these developments are in the interest of justice for Mr. Floyd, his family, our community, and our state.
And Baldwin reminds us, paraphrasing, that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. This is the tipping point.
Welcome to a special edition of Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast and others of you are joining us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. Tonight, standing for George Floyd, a nation protests. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We are working with limited staff and our guests are joining us remotely. Joining us tonight, Dr. Michael Jeffries, Associate Professor of American Studies, Wellesley College. Renee Graham, Associate Editor and columnist for the Boston Globe's op-ed page. Kim McLarin, Associate Professor and Graduate Program Director of Writing, Literature, and Publishing at Emerson College. And Phillip Martin, Senior Investigative Reporter, NECIR WGBH News. Welcome to all of you. But first, Brent Williams is joining us from Minnesota Public Radio, where he has been on the ground reporting the story of George Floyd's killing and the aftermath. Hello, Brent.
Hi, Callie.
You covered the first of what will be many memorials for George Floyd across the country, but of course yours is very important because it's in Minneapolis. Tell us the mood. How did people feel?
Well, Callie, I was out at a park, Elliott Park, which is right across the street from the sanctuary where the service was held. And they placed some speakers out on tops of the buildings so the music and the eulogies could echo across the park. So I spent the afternoon just out talking with people as they listened to the eulogy and the service. And I was struck by the number of, especially Black women that I spoke with, who expressed sentiments like one of the women who was featured in your trailer up to this to the program, who told me they have Black sons and they fear every day for them. They are tired of having to tell them that they should be submissive to police officers. I spoke to a woman who, she was very emotional. She was pounding her fist in her hand as she told me, she said, I raised my boys. They didn't just grow up. I raised them to have values and to be good people. No one has the right to take their lives from them and from me.
Brent, will the protests continue, or is this, or were you at a pause in Minneapolis now?
Well, the demonstrations are going to continue. Not sure at what level, but the site of Mr. Floyd's death, the corner of 38th in Chicago, remains something of a shrine to him. It's a place where people come to reflect on his life and what change needs to be made to make sure other people don't wind up dying at the hands of police officers, not only here in Minneapolis, but other places. So I expect to see more demonstrations happen. Perhaps they will be not nearly as the same scale as what we saw in the days after Mr. Floyd's death, but I expect there to be people still in the streets.
Thank you so much for that update, Brent.
You're welcome.
Michael Jeffries, a question. March 25th, 2020, this year, just a few days ago, 11 days to be precise, Mr. Floyd was killed. The protests started. They're here and around the world. But prior to that, most recently, we'd seen Amy Cooper in accusing Chris Cooper, threatening him in Central Park. We'd seen Ahmaud Arbery be gunned down on videotape. Both of these things were on videotape. Why now, this incident, George Floyd's death, did it set off something that lots of people had to respond to?
I think there are a confluence of factors, and one name that you didn't mention is Breonna Taylor in Louisville, who was murdered by police in her own home. So, and that was prior to Floyd as well. So this had been building. These cases had been coming one after another. A few things that I think made this a particular case that exploded the way that it did were, number one, the video. The video is gruesome. It is horrifying. It is undeniable. And in the face of that sort of visual evidence of police conduct and this pattern of police killing of Black folks, the public has no other choice but to react in the way that it did. That's one piece of it. I think another thing that we have to remember is the overlay of this with the crisis that is COVID and the global pandemic. We've had about 39 million Americans file for unemployment since March. People are living in poverty. People are unable to afford medical care. And the people that I'm talking about are overwhelmingly Black and brown, and were working class or poor to begin with. So the kinds of trauma that we're talking about are not just trauma at the hands of police, not just violence in the kind of physical sense at the hands of police, but the violence of poverty, the violence of neglect, and living in desperation that was intensified by COVID and then ignited by the Floyd killing.
And we should say that the recent labor statistics that have just been released, 13.3% of all Americans are unemployed, but 16.8% of Black Americans are unemployed. Renee, you've said this is an overwhelming moment, but are you concerned? Because as Michael said, the video is overwhelming, but are you concerned that people will isolate this and say, well, nothing else could possibly be this bad, and they don't connect it with anything else, despite we've just given a list of some recent incidents?
Well, I think it's absurd to even make that statement for those who are doing it, because almost 6 years ago, we watched Eric Garner on a street in Staten Island choked to death, literally saying the same thing that George Floyd said, "I can't breathe." And you start to wonder, every time these things happen, they're not isolated. It's not, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. This happens all the time. And I think one of the only differences with George Floyd is it's on videotape. That's what people are reacting to. And I don't know that we would be getting the same reaction if it was not on videotape. There have been other instances that have come up in recent days of Black men also dying in chokeholds around the country. Now people are saying, oh, those officers should be arrested. Oh, this other thing should happen. Well, where was this going on before? The Floyd video becomes a trigger because we've seen it, and some stations, I think someone unfortunately, have had it on a loop. It becomes a kind of murder porn. But I think at the same time, the reason why we're having these conversations is because we're seeing the videotape, and I hope that people understand this is not a one-off. This is not an isolated incident.
So, Kim, much has been made of the multiracial nature of these protests, not just here in the country, but also outside of the country, so many other places. And a lot of white people, a lot of young white people. What do you make of that? And do you think that this signifies some change, some deeper understanding?
I think it's a good thing. I have to say I'm not there have been moments in the past, and I want to just say I agree with Renee, not only Eric Gardner, but I covered the Rodney King riots in 1992, right? This happened in 1992. And like then, there was outrage and surprise and shock from white Americans. Perhaps not at this scale, but people were shocked. And then, of course, the protest became violent, triggered by the police, and there was backlash. So, you know, I think it's fantastic that all these young people of all colors, races, and hues are out on the street. I won't believe this is real until I see this continue, right? I think this is great. I think Michael Jeffries has outlined why this is happening. In addition, for Black people, we understand who is dying of COVID. And I think that was also part of it. We saw white America push to reopen when they understood that we were the ones who were dying, right? So that happened 2 weeks ago, and now this happened. Which is the real white America? That's what I'm waiting to see.
Phillip, there's been a narrative of one bad apple or a few bad apples in police departments. But what we know is that in a lot of these instances, the cops who were involved, including Derek Chauvin, had a prior history of not just bad behavior, near fatal behavior. He had 17 complaints against him. And that we have seen repeated over and over again. So we're talking about a culture, some ways that we have learned to train, the militarization of the police. I wonder if you would respond to just trying to get people to understand that it's not an inherent people of color opposition to police, but it's born out of a history and out of some real data about who these people have been who've caused the death of some of these citizens.
That's right. Data and the lack of repercussions. We've seen many, as my colleagues have pointed out, many deaths and constant death across the country at the hands of police. Most of this, you talk about the culture, and here's what is a key factor. Even when there are talk and actual policies based that are predicated on reform, you find the culture is fortified. And the reason it's fortified is because of many times because of police unions. Minneapolis, for example, has one of the most reactionary police unions in the country. It's led by a guy who, in fact, has ridden into a crowd of Black police officers on a motorcycle with a white power insignia on his person, on his uniform. And there's been complaints about him over the years. His name is Kroll, and he is the head of the Minneapolis Police Union. Well, you find police unions all over the country who are similarly reactionary. And they essentially will protect a police officer no matter what. And that is part of the problem. But there's also the institutionalized nature of these problems that go deeper than police unions, where laws themselves have been established to protect police officers no matter what they do, which is why Eric Holder's Justice Department, for example, during the Obama era, refused to or decline, rather, to bring charges against some of the police officers involved, the police officer involved in the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, because he felt he could not win that case. Why the Justice Department declined to move any further in regarding the killer of Eric Garner on Staten Island.
Okay.
Because they figured they couldn't go much further. And now you have a Justice Department led by William Barr, which folks are up in arms correctly and understandably about burnings and lootings. But look at what is happening that is perhaps even more violent, bringing in the Department of Prisons, unnamed and unmarked police officers or federal officials, if you will, on the streets of our cities. In this,
okay, let me take it back from you, Phillip. Let me take it back from you, because that's what leads me into Renee. Renee, you've been concerned about the people who are out there protesting with a great amount of legitimacy about what the real issues are being caught up in the narrative about violent looters.
Well, if you listen to a lot of the TV reports, especially the ones in the last few days, they'll say, well, protests were mostly peaceful, as if that hasn't been the case from the beginning. And I think the media has been too quick to conflate what's happening with the protest and people who have exploited a moment to go loot a store, whatever the case is. I think that is a way of kind of branding the whole protest as being illegitimate. Oh, there's just people rioting in the streets. Oh, those black people are at it again. And also when you say that, it legitimizes the way the police behave. Well, the police have to keep order. So this is what must be done. And it's just a really ugly narrative. And it's not even a new narrative. You know, this whole idea, they seem surprised that the protests are peaceful. They have been peaceful. You know, what happens after dark is something else entirely. We certainly saw that happen in Boston, where there were massive protests that were peaceful. And then after the fact, this other thing kind of started in different parts of the city, which had nothing to do with the protest. You know, it's not like these people were breaking windows with signs that said Black Lives Matter, but that's the way it got portrayed. You know, and we've seen the case where the police have been overwhelmingly violent, you know, almost in every case where someone has been hurt at these protests, it's been at police hands. It's not protesters hurting each other. It's the police who are causing the bulk of the violence. Well, in fact, we just seen the video of the 75-year-old white man protester in daylight pushed by the some Buffalo policemen on the street and left there. His head is bleeding. We don't know. The city has responded saying they're going to do an investigation. And just to say, because I know the area, that's in the shadow of City Hall, in the shadow of Buffalo City Hall, where that happened. Kim?
I just want to make the point that everything Renee said is correct, that much of the violence is instigated either by the police or by provocateurs. But setting that aside, we are not required to peacefully protest our own genocide. I find that argument outrageous. No other people are obligated to beg and plead not to be killed peacefully. That is an obscene argument, and I resent it incredibly. We have been peaceful for 400 years in this country. And what has it gotten us? If you think I'm angry, you are right, because I'm one of those women who has a Black son and a Black daughter. And the fact that we are required to peacefully protest our own genocide is an obscene, inhumane argument.
Thank you, Phillip. Michael, one of the things I look to you as contextual and placing in history, placing all of this in the spectrum of history. What I noticed over and over again, and I'm not sure people know where it came from, a lot of protesters saying, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. Some I don't know that is from Fannie Lou Hamer, who was born in Ruleville, became a civil rights organizer, was nearly beaten to death because she decided to register to vote. And here's the full quote. And I've been tired so long now, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, and we want to change. I've gone to a lot of big cities, and I've got to go to my first big city to go to where this man wasn't standing with his feet on the Black man's neck. I just couldn't believe that, how prescient that was. But Michael, put this in a historical context and a cultural context, if you would.
I mean, Hamer is really one of the greatest leaders in our culture's history for exactly that reason. She could articulate what the issue was, and the time that she put in as an organizer, you know, prior to any recognition, without any hope of celebrity or acclaim, she was doing it for all the right reasons. And I think the organizing history of the civil rights struggle and the Black liberation struggle is an important backdrop for all of this. But what's interesting, I think, about this moment is these uprisings that we're seeing right now are not that tightly coordinated. If you look at the civil rights movement, for example, we're talking about decades and decades of organizational work and planning and funding, right, to make these kinds of those movements happen, those protests happen. The iconic protests of American history in the mid-20th century, these are springing up instantaneously because of the desperation. We have no choice but to be out in the street. And the other piece of this is it's being fueled by the reaction of the state, by the violent repression. This is a protest about, among other things, police brutality, and the police are being increasingly brutal, right? So it legitimizes the protest and puts more gasoline on the fire. So I think that in some ways it bears similarities when you talk about the level of frustration and desperation, but the organizational dynamics and the relationship between the protesters and the state is quite different today.
The American Psychological Association had put out a statement saying that this is a racial pandemic with as much harm that can be done in addition to the coronavirus pandemic that we're in. And the organization talked about the psychological damage being done on African Americans. I'm going to start with you, Kim, about just trying to personally come to grips with what of the whole Floyd death, but all of the ramifications, just what that felt like. Where were you emotionally?
I will be frank, I have been alternating between numbness and almost resignation, because I know I personally have been writing and talking, and all of us have been writing and talking and begging and pleading about this for decades. And of course, our people have been doing it since David Walker, right, in 1831, and before that, Frederick Douglass, Phyllis Wheatley, right? This is nothing new. Every time we have to reawaken white America. So I have been, at first I was numb. I didn't watch the video because I'm tired of seeing violence enacted upon Black men. I couldn't watch it. I didn't want to watch it. I've been alternating between numbness and rage. I will tell you, I am enraged. And then, this is a aside, I know I personally have been getting emails from white people, many of whom don't even know me, asking, what can I do? As if it's my job to educate them and bring them along to what we have been saying forever. So yes, I had to actually step away from Twitter for my own mental health, because it is unbelievably stressful and damaging to us as human beings. And yes, it is absolutely a racial pandemic, and has been. This is not new,
Renee.
I tilt between rage and exhaustion. Yesterday during George Floyd's funeral, literally at the same time, Senator Rand Paul was on the floor of the Senate lecturing Kamala Harris and Cory Booker about lynching and why it would not meet the standard of being a federal hate crime. Like, that's where we are in America. You're burying a man who was lynched, and you have a sitting U.S. senator talking about how, oh no, I'm sorry, lynching is not a federal hate crime. And so yesterday I just felt exhausted. I just felt completely worn out, and that's what it has felt like in some ways through the beginning of this pandemic, because, as a journalist, you don't get to step away from it. You're writing about it, but it's also happening to you. So when New York was the epicenter of the epicenter was the neighborhood I grew up in. It's the neighborhood where my 80-year-old uncle still lives in the house my family has owned for nearly 70 years. So you have the tension of that. Then you have the tension of what happened to Breonna Taylor and what happened to Ahmaud Arbery. And the fact that you weren't even hearing about it in real time. You were hearing about it later. And then you add to that what happened in Central Park with Christian Cooper. And the next day, you have the video of George Floyd. It feels like you are under siege the minute you get up. And I was saying to someone who said, I've had a lot of trouble sleeping. I'm like, I sleep fine. The problem I have is getting up the next morning. It is like there's a weight on me that holds me down that I can barely push off to get out of bed in the morning.
Phillip?
Look, I would be shocked if rage is not the word for all of us. All of us are enraged by what we saw in Minneapolis. And yes, we've seen it before. It continues to be repeated. But also, I think I could add the word hope. I've been out on the streets, as you know, covering some of these demonstrations. And it is absolutely, there is something. We've seen white Americans respond to the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, after the killings of Trayvon Martin and Brown and Garner. We saw those. But what we also are seeing, as a young man said who I interviewed, Black Lives Matter coming out of the mouths of white faces.
All right, I'm going to Phillip, I'm going to stop you there because I want to get Michael in before we have to go. Michael.
All right.
What's the question? How am I feeling?
Yeah.
I mean, I can only echo what everyone on the panel has said. Of course, I'm furious. This is a theater of the absurd, And one of the things that's tiring about it is feeling like you're one of the few that's living in reality, and we've been living in reality for so long, and it feels like everyone else is just getting a peek behind the curtain now. So I think with that, the constant need to redouble our efforts to retain our focus, that's the burden we carry in addition to the hurt and the pain. And the performance of that hurt and pain in public, I certainly don't decry that in any way. Everyone's entitled to express themselves. But we have to understand that that mere performance in and of itself is not going to be what changes things. We have to demand and insist upon institutional, structural changes, not just rely on emotional appeals.
I thank you all very much for your insight, because this is really a tough conversation to have. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That's the end of our broadcast and the end of our show. Thank you for joining us, and I want you to stay with us right now as we continue our conversation on Facebook and Twitter. Before we leave you tonight, we want to show you the emotional video of a song that went viral on social media, sung by Kedron Bryant, expressing the thoughts and feelings so many young black boys are thinking.
I'm a young black man doing all that I can to stand. Oh, but when I look around and I see what's being done to my kind, every day I'm being hunted as prey. My people don't want no trouble. We've had enough struggle. I just wanna live. God protect me. I just wanna live. I just wanna live.